To understand the world of Lucas Malet, you have to understand a specific kind of darkness that sits just beneath the surface of a well-manicured English estate. In her novel, The History of Sir Richard Calmady, a romance, that darkness is called the germ of canker. It's the idea that even in the most beautiful, orderly, and aristocratic families, there is an inherent seed of decay or doom waiting to bloom. This isn't a ghost story in the traditional sense, but the characters are haunted by something much more real: their own blood, their physical bodies, and the heavy weight of what they must do to maintain the dignity of their names. The story begins at Brockhurst, the ancestral seat of the Calmady family. We meet the current heir, Richard Calmady, and his wife, Katherine. Their life seems settled, but there is a sense of destiny hanging over them, a feeling that the family history is a predator waiting in the shadows. Adding to this tension is Richard's cousin, Julius March. Julius has come to Brockhurst to serve as the family chaplain, but he is a man in the midst of a profound spiritual crisis. He is caught between the Anglicanism of his upbringing and a deep, magnetic pull toward Catholicism. As he watches the intense, almost overwhelming romantic bond between Richard and Katherine, he finds himself struggling with his own vows of chastity and his sense of purpose. The stability of the household is shattered when Richard is involved in a devastating racing accident. It's a moment that changes the trajectory of the family forever. Richard survives the initial crash, but he is left broken. He undergoes a failed amputation, a process that leaves him in a state of slow, agonizing physical and spiritual decline. He doesn't die quickly. Instead, he lingers, caught in a struggle to reconcile his physical suffering with his soul's needs. Eventually, Richard dies, leaving Katherine a widow and, crucially, pregnant. The aftermath of his death brings a tragedy that is both deeply personal and almost mythic in its cruelty. Katherine gives birth to a son, whom she initially names St. Julius. But the joy of a new heir is instantly replaced by horror. The child is born with a severe physical deformity. In the novel, Malet describes Katherine's reaction not as a moment of madness, but as an impulse of savage mercy. Realizing that her son will be forced to endure a lifetime of profound suffering and social isolation, Katherine is gripped by a devastating desire to end his misery before it can truly begin. This impulse is manifested not by harming the child, but through the symbolic death of a racehorse, a surrogate sacrifice that captures the grim reality of the Calmady legacy. Because the act of mercy was symbolic, the child survives this period of crisis. 12 years pass, and the narrative shifts to the next generation. We follow the son, now known as Richard or Dickie, the surviving heir who has grown up in the shadow of these family secrets. Dickie is a complex, restless adolescent. He is physically limited, carrying the weight of his father's death and the unspoken traumas of the household. As he grows, he tries to compensate for his physical frailty through intellect, eventually finding success at Oxford. But beneath the polished exterior of a scholar, there is a deep, simmering restlessness. His life becomes increasingly complicated by the arrival of his cousin, Helen de Vallorbe. Helen is a sophisticated, worldly woman who moves through high society with ease, but she possesses an intensity that draws Dickie in. She becomes the object of his fascination, a personification of the very passion and sensation he feels he is forbidden from pursuing. As Dickie enters adulthood, the social web around him becomes incredibly tangled. We see the Fallowfield family, where marriage is treated less like a romantic union and more like a cold financial transaction. We also meet Honoria Stane-Quentin, a woman of immense character and a rigid sense of moral duty. Honoria becomes a central figure in a web of romantic entanglements involving the gentleman Ludovic Quayle and a woman named Constance Quayle. Constance is described as almost saintly, a person of pure intention. The tension in this social circle reaches a breaking point during a confrontation on a balcony. A failed marriage arrangement between Richard and the saintly Constance is exposed, threatening to disrupt the social order. Honoria, acting on a sense of moral duty rather than personal desire, orchestrates the breaking of the engagement. She does this to save Constance from a life of loveless, dutiful marriage, even though it means Honoria herself must grapple with the guilt of her interference. It's a moment that highlights a recurring theme in Malet's work: the idea that maintaining social stability or achieving a certain kind of moral truth often requires a heavy sacrifice of human passion or innocence. Now we find Richard, the younger Richard, Dickie, as a man of immense wealth but profound psychological struggle. He is a man divided. He is caught in a constant battle between what Malet calls the natural man, the part of him driven by primal, almost animalistic passion and sensation, and the pilgrim, the part of him seeking spiritual perfection and asceticism. He cannot find a middle ground. This internal conflict drives him toward a period of intense, nihilistic rebellion. He tries to escape his own sense of monstrosity, a feeling born from his physical limitations and his awareness of his family's dark history, by traveling and seeking out extreme sensations. He wants to feel something that can drown out the quiet, persistent ache of his own existence. During his travels, he finds himself in Naples, where he encounters Helen de Valorbes again. Their relationship becomes a battlefield. Helen represents a grand, overwhelming passion, a life lived fully in the flesh. Richard, however, is constantly retreating toward a desire for ascetic isolation. He wants to strip everything away, to become nothing, to escape the burden of being a man with desires and a body that fails him. The novel doesn't end in a sudden explosion of drama, but in a gradual, hard-won transition. Richard's journey moves from a state of brokenness and nihilism toward a disciplined, purposeful acceptance of his life. He doesn't fix himself, and he doesn't suddenly become a different kind of man. Instead, he finds a way to reconcile the two halves of his soul. He learns to integrate the natural man with the pilgrim. He settles into a life of service and quietude, finding a way to exist within his limitations rather than constantly trying to shatter them. As he finds this peace, the women in his life reach their own complex resolutions. Katherine, Honoria, and Helen all continue to exist in the shadow of his transformation, their own lives shaped by the gravity of his presence and the secrets they all carry. When we look back at the story of the Calmady family, a few major themes emerge that make this more than just a standard Victorian romance. First, there is the germ of canker. Malet is suggesting that darkness isn't something that comes from the outside. It is something inherent in the structures we build, the families we belong to, and the very biology we inherit. Even the most perfect estate, like Brockhurst, has a rot at its centre. Then there is the theme of the duality of man. This isn't just a psychological observation, it's presented as a fundamental, agonizing tension. The struggle between our primal instincts and our spiritual aspirations is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed. Richard's struggle is a heightened, almost extreme version of the struggle we all face, how to live a meaningful life when our bodies and our desires are constantly at odds with our ideals. We also see a sharp contrast between social masking and physical reality. The characters spend a great deal of energy maintaining the polished performance of Victorian etiquette, but the reality of their lives is often much more raw, often monstrous, and frequently defined by physical suffering or unconventional desire. The social world is a mask that people wear to hide the complicated, often painful truth of their existence. Finally, there is the cost of truth. The characters who seek the truth, whether it's Honoria seeking moral truth or Richard seeking psychological truth, often have to pay a high price. Truth often requires the destruction of illusions, and the destruction of illusions often leads to loneliness, guilt, or the loss of innocence. Lucas Malet was a writer of immense skill, and the history of Sir Richard Calmady is a testament to her ability to push the boundaries of the Victorian novel. She moves away from the comfortable, moralizing tales of her contemporaries and into a much more unsettling, proto-modernist territory. She explores the body, the subconscious, and the darker impulses of the human spirit with a directness that was quite radical for her time. The novel is not an easy read, nor is it a comforting one. It is a study of endurance. It's about how people navigate a world that is often cruel, physically limiting, and spiritually confusing. In the end, the story isn't about finding happiness in the traditional sense. It's about finding a way to live with the truth of who you are, even when that truth is difficult to bear. Richard Calmady's path from a wounded, restless youth to a man of disciplined acceptance is a journey through the very heart of the human condition.